I'm inspired. I saw that last Sunday's sermon was still up here. Someone should clean this place out for fear that I might repeat the same sermon. And if you barely survived it the first time, there's no telling what you would do to me if you actually heard it twice and figured out what I was saying. I want to talk about God with secular humanists, atheists, agnostic, people with no faith, non-religious people, or a room full of philosophers. That's our subject. I want to talk about God. At first you would think that the people who worship God, who come to God's house, the last thing you would need to have is a conversation about how to have conversations about God. But I'm not sure that we have retained our ability to have conversations with God outside this building with people who have no faith at all. I'm not sure if we are timid, reticent, or afraid of people who do not believe in God. We have been taught, wrongly I will insist, that smart people no longer believe in God. I have a book somewhere in one of my libraries entitled, Can a Smart Person Believe in God? I read it, and I found the book to be insulting, demeaning, arrogant, and condescending. And if you ask me, I'll tell you how I really feel about it. I didn't need to read the book to answer that question. I just went ahead and answered the question, yes, a smart person can believe in God. I hang around with smart people who believe in God, so I know it's possible. But the answer I'm going to give to this question may surprise you. And the answer is found here in the Bible, in the text that we read earlier today, the 17th chapter of Acts. The sermon is based on the text. I have to remind you of that from time to time, for fear that you might forget that I would never dare preach a sermon not based on a text. The person who's speaking to a gathered audience of pagans, philosophers, is St. Paul, the Apostle. He stands on what is a giant hill, a rock outcropping of the Acropolis in Athens, where what amounts to the Greek Senate held debates and murder trials were conducted. I want you to know the contrast between the Athenian rock, where debates were held, and the Jerusalem rock called Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified. So on a hill, Paul faced the collected array of Greek philosophers, the embedded wisdom of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And the text tells us that Paul argued in a synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons. Luke tells us that Paul was greatly distressed. He felt a lot of anxiety and tension, and he was under a lot of stress when he realized that the city was filled with all kinds of idolatries. So when Paul is under distress, what does he do? He argues. I like this because when I get agitated, that's what I do. I argue. And sometimes it may not be in my best interest because I pick an argument with someone I probably shouldn't be arguing with. I'll let you guess how that ends. But Paul argued in the synagogue with the Jews, the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with anybody who happened to be standing around. He was a real go-getter, don't you think? He debated Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. Now, the Epicureans are fond of or adapted to a life of luxury and indulgence. They were the leisure class. They had luxurious taste or habits, especially in eating and drinking. There's a lot of that in us Baptists. We like eating and drinking. The Stoics were the opposite. They insisted on enduring life by gritting their teeth without showing emotion and accepting their fate. They were a depressed people. Many atheists today are Stoics. For example, a self-professed atheist who teaches at the University of Texas wrote an amazing essay entitled Without God. Without God. He claimed it is not easy to live without God. I would agree with that. I also don't think it's easy to live with God sometimes. You Someone once said to a young man, "You should get ordained." He said, "I'm not sure about that. I don't know that I would like the ordainers. It's not always easy to live with God's people either." But this guy says, without God, here's his whole argument, and I quote, "There is a certain honor, a grim satisfaction in facing up to our condition without despair or wishful thinking, with good humor, but without God." So I looked at that for a while and I thought, well, okay, that just doesn't seem like a lot to go on if you ask me. In living my life, I would like to have something more to go on than grim satisfaction. A certain honor, living without God. But that's the kind of religious environment that we have in our culture today. So I've decided that atheism is not as interesting as it claims to be. And I also do not believe that its claims are as intelligent, as convincing as many people think. So I'm surprised when Christians are intimidated by atheist philosophy. I'm not sure if they're scared or if they have an atheist crush. Somehow we've got the idea that to walk around saying you do not believe in God is liberating and shocking. And so it's something you just like to do. I don't really believe in God. I don't really like God's stuff. I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. I got to tell you, I have absolutely no idea what that means. I get that from people all the time. My usual response is, "Oh, you don't go to church." That's usually exactly what that means. So, in date night, one of my very best friends, I had a daughter who was as smart as anybody I've ever met. She was practically a genius, and she knew it. And so we had lots and lots of meals together. And at every meal, she would smile at me and say to me, "Dr. Kennedy, I'm an atheist." And I would never take the bait. I would just smile and say, "I'm sorry, but you are not old enough to know whether or not you're an atheist. Get back to me in a few years." So when she went to college and converted to Judaism, I called her and said, "See, I told you were not an atheist. You believe in God." At this point, I was okay that she didn't convert to being a Baptist like her parents had done when they left the Catholic Church. But I was happy that she had come to the realization that she believed in the one true God. I'm saying to you, there's no reason to be afraid of atheists or arguments or conversations about God in the marketplace. You just don't need to get bent out of shape like you're going to hurt somebody's feelings. Now, this doesn't mean that I want you walking up to people shoving gospel tracts in their faces and asking somebody, "Are you saved, brother?" Now, I don't think anybody in this congregation would ever do that, but if you've been thinking about it, please don't do it. It scares people. It's not a good introduction to talking about God. So, what I'm telling you is that the Scripture is more relevant than you might want to give it credit for being. Because what Paul faces in Athens, we face in Peoria. There's the secular culture, there's the church. By all human standards, the church today faces overwhelming odds. Some of our leaders are so convinced that the church is dying, they've already written our obituary. I read at least a dozen of those books back in the first decade of this century, and they were so depressing, rather than take drugs, I just quit reading them. In the 70s, I quit reading all the books about God being dead. I didn't think God was dead. I love what the African-American pastor of Los Angeles said about the God is dead theology. He said, "This can't be true. I'm a member of the immediate family and nobody called me." Yes! So we face this overwhelming odds. We may be bigger underdogs than the 1969 Jets or the 1986 Mets. They think the church is finished, but we're not done yet. God is still raising up people, faithful people who can talk about God in the marketplace. The church needs to recover this authentic voice of respect and reason. And I believe that Paul's approach is our best shot. Paul uses a way to proclaim God to a culture riddled with many gods and many philosophies. And Luke tells us that Paul was going about telling everybody about the good news of Jesus and his resurrection. But when you read the sermon, it doesn't sound Christian. But I believe it contains the clue to how we can talk to non-religious people. I believe this to be as close to a perfect sermon as you could possibly get. I try every week to preach a perfect sermon. And when I'm finished, I'm always disappointed. Usually somebody's got to scrape me up off the floor because I just realized how pathetic it really was. And then on Monday, I say to myself, this week I'm going to do it. I'm going to preach the perfect sermon. I think I told you of a country music singer who had decided he had written the perfect song, and he sent it to his friend, and his friend sent it right back and said, you have not written the perfect country song. You didn't say anything about mama, or dogs, or trains, or getting drunk, or prison. So he said, I sat down and wrote a new verse that said, I was drunk the day my mama got out of prison. And I was driving in my pickup truck and ran over a dog, and then a train ran over my pickup truck. You just can't write the perfect song. I can't preach the perfect sermon. But I think Paul came up with a real gem. And what he does is he immediately tries to identify with his audience. In the speech world, we call this establishing rapport. It's a French word that means to give a giant hug. You know, you can talk to someone if you can hug them. Now, that doesn't mean everybody likes to be hugged, so you have to be careful with that. But in any event, to establish rapport. And notice that he compliments his audience. He does not criticize them. I find a lot of Christian conversation to be like teeth-gritting conversation. It's loaded with judgment, condemnation, finger pointing and shaking and telling people they better straighten up that spotlight or God's going to get them for that. I find that so boring. He says to them, you are very religious. I toured your city and you've got quite an impressive collection of gods. Everybody who goes to a new city to make a speech or give a performance, what do? They always brag on the city. And I promise you that they had to check with somebody just before they went out there to be reminded what the name of this city is. Have you ever been in a show where the guy popped out and said the wrong name? I mean, you can't get more embarrassing than that. But everybody that comes to Peoria says, it's great to be here in Peoria. Okay? I traveled around 44 states for 10 years, and I was in more than 2,500 places. And I always started out by saying it's great to be here. I went to South Dakota, and I went to the capital city of South Dakota that has barely 9,600 people living there. And I'm from South Louisiana, and there's French in my blood, and I looked at that word, and it was Pierre. Everybody knows that P-I-E-R-E is Pierre. And I said, it's so great to be in Pierre. And the Scandinavian Lutherans all went, no, it's Pierre. Pierre. I was in shock. I wasn't sure I could continue with my presentation. But everybody says, it's great to be here. I was sitting in the Schuster Center waiting for Jerry Seinfeld to make one of his comedy performances. He's a really funny guy. He walks out, he looks around, he looks way up to the top of our 4,400-seat, $25 million arena in downtown Dayton, and he says, I love the theater here in Dayton, but I must tell you that I feel the need to see other theaters. And everybody just cracked up laughing because he said something nice about us. That's what Paul does. He's on a missionary journey, not a cruise of the Mediterranean, and he did this every day. Every day he invited people to believe in Jesus, but he doesn't do so in an eccentric, weird, kind of pushy way. He adapts to the language of his audience. Speech communication theorists will tell you it's the audience that actually determines the content of the speech. It's not what I say that matters, it's what you hear me say. You are the determining factor. I didn't know that for years until I listened to what people thought I had said on Sunday morning. I got really chewed out really bad one Sunday by a lady who didn't even actually hear what I said. She thought I'd said something and I hadn't actually even said that. It's just stuff that happens. And one day I was preaching in a very small, very conservative Baptist church down in Mississippi, and I accidentally forgot myself. I'd been taught not to talk about politics or sex or money, and I said the word sex. And a lady in the back just about had a heart he wants you to know about Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, the Savior of the world. But he does it in a language that people will understand. And sometimes I think we Christians have forgotten that. We think everybody speaks our language, but I got to tell you it's not true. The reason they don't speak our language is that we don't spend a lot of time speaking it ourselves anymore. But Paul faces an Athenian audience that's okay talking about gods in the plural, because this city was crawling with gods. There were more gods in Athens than garage sales in Peoria in the springtime. Debates raged about the gods. And Paul puts his finger on the Achilles heel of all pagan notions of God. They were afraid of the gods because they thought they were crazy, insane, unpredictable, given to large, childish temper tantrums. You never knew what a god might do next. And they feared the arbitrary, capricious ways of the gods. And they were so scared that even made a statue to the unknown God. Now this is so funny. It really is. This is when you should be laughing. In case we left one out, this statue is for you. If we don't know your name, this is your statue. Please don't hurt us, unknown God. You see, the Greeks, good politicians, one and all, covered all their deity bases with a statue for any god they may have left out. I guess you didn't think it was funny. But I can't be funny all the time, so you're going to have to quit pressuring me. Then Paul says to the Athenians, I went through your city and I looked carefully at the objects of your worship. Now this is not funny. I'm not sure I want someone with the spiritual wisdom of St. Paul applying his spiritual insight to identifying what we actually worship in our daily lives. Most of us would prefer to keep our gods in the closet. But I believe it to be one of the primary purposes of a preacher to apply the wisdom of Scripture to the ways of the world. I actually think God gave us the Bible so the church can have an instrument to self-correct what we don't do right and what we need to straighten out. And I believe that a preacher who lacks the courage to name our idolatries and point our false gods is not worth a bucket of warm spit, as Senator Cactus Jack Garner of Texas once said of the office of the vice presidency. And he should know because he served 2 terms as vice president under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, in the 1960s in the South, when it was hazardous to a preacher's health to confront racism, John Hurt, the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Jonesboro, Louisiana, where I would a few years later become senior pastor, bravely confronted racism in his preaching in a town that was in the national news. In the 1960s, if you watched the news, you would have seen images of Selma, Alabama, Jonesboro, Louisiana, and Bogalusa, Louisiana. And if you were really good Christians at that time, you could have felt smug and say, well, we don't act like that here. All those nasty racists in the South. So John would tell them that their racism was wrong in the eyes of God. And people asked John, how do you get away with that? And John said, well, one Sunday I get up and blast racism, and I make them all madder than a wet hen. And the next Sunday I get up and I preach against whiskey drinking and win them all back. John was a good politician. And that's what you have to be if you're going to be a preacher, because only a politician can do that. And a preacher must possess a skin as tough as an armadillo rather than the soft, easily insulted, and insecurity of many secular politicians. I think preachers have to have nerves of steel in order to stand up to the powers and principalities, even when they are in the church and may even be deacons. Don Harbaugh was the pastor of the First Baptist Church in El Dorado, Arkansas, about the same period of time. And one Sunday morning, he preached a powerful sermon against the segregation in Little Rock. And as he finished that sermon, one member of the church was really irate. He didn't say anything, but he stalked out of there. On Monday morning, Dr. Harbaugh was at the barber shop getting shaved. That's a brave preacher, preach on racism, and then let the barber take a razor to you throat. And the moment he had the white towel all wrapped around his face and he didn't know who was there, this irate church member stomped into the barber shop and shouted out loud, "If I knew where that little SOB was," now in the South, that's Baptist for son of a bishop. "If I knew where that son of a bishop was, I'd whip his butt." And so Dr. Harbuck removed the towel from his face, stood up, and said, "Well, here's that little SOB. What do you want to do about it?" And the church member dropped his head and sneaked out the front door without even a whimper. He's always been one of my heroes. Not that guy that was cussing. I'm talking about that preacher who knew how to stand up to that which is not right. Preachers are tough enough to know that we all have gods, and we have to have the gumption to say it out loud. But the problem I face is that our gods are sneakier. They're harder to nail down because they're not made out of silver and gold. Our gods are ideologies and wealth and politics and sports and junk like that. We may not even know that we worship other gods, but I think it's hard to leave the house without tripping over one. We even drag our ragtail gods inside the church like an Old Testament king, unable to resist desecrating the house of God with foreign idols. And Paul takes them all on. What a preacher. Paul takes on all of them. And he says, the unknown God is the God I'm going to name out loud for you. In a brilliant rhetorical move, he says, I'm going to tell you the true name of your unknown God. He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob who created the world. Do you see what he does there? He starts with a known part of their culture, their own statue, the unknown God, and he gives that God a name. And he says, your unknown God is actually known. He actually is known. I met him on the road to Damascus. You see, this personal experience of God is what the atheists have no answer for in all of their brilliant subjectivities. They can't account for personal experience. And if you have a personal experience of God, it doesn't mean that you lack intelligence. It means that you have had a deeply moving spiritual experience. And empirical evidence cannot prove or disprove your experience. I don't think you should let people make fun of your experience. In Clive Edgerson's beautiful, funny novel called Rainey, Rainey is a Free Will Baptist girl married to a church of an Episcopalian university librarian, and they get into an argument one day, right after they got married, in which Charles, her husband, who's a little bit on the snooty side, starts to make fun of her personal experience of Jesus Christ. And Rainey stops him right there and said, Charles, you can make fun of anything you want to make fun of in this house. You can make fun of my mama, you can make fun of how I do the dishes, but when you start running down my personal experience of Jesus Christ, my personal Savior, you are lower than a snake's belly. And oh, by the way, Charles never did that again. So, Paul tells people that this God is real because he has experienced him. And he knew their philosophy. You probably know this, but he quotes Greek poets here. He does not quote the Bible. He knows their philosophy. There's something good about a school that insists that students know something about philosophy and have at least a rudimentary knowledge of Plato and Aristotle. Paul begins with creation because the Greeks had been arguing about creation for centuries. He doesn't start with, do you believe in Jesus? He starts with, you seem to know a lot about creation. He said, let me tell you about this God who created the world. He gives life and breath and everything. In him we live and move and have our being. What an amazing speech. Paul tells them that he believes in God. He uses this to get them to open their minds to new possibilities. Now this is hard work. But because it's hard to talk about God doesn't mean you ought to stop talking about God. You know what Tom Hanks said in A League of Their Own, don't you? He said to the women playing baseball for him, of course it's hard. If it wasn't hard, everyone would do it. The hard is what makes it great. If it's hard to talk about God, you just need more practice. You just need to work at it out not to be much. You have a chance here to help people believe in something that matters. God and Jesus Christ. We have a chance here to have real conversations because our world is full of people who believe anything about anybody and they'll put their faith and trust in it. Did you see the baseball movie Bull Durham? I love Bull Durham. Well, Annie Savoy says that I believe in the Church of Baseball. I've tried all the major religions and most of the minor ones. I worship Buddha, Allah, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, trees, mushrooms, and Isidore Duncan. I know things. For instance, there are 108 beads in the Catholic Rosary. You need to check that. That may not be right. And there are 108 stitches in a baseball. When I learned that, I gave Jesus a chance, but it didn't work out between us. The Lord put too much guilt on me. I prefer metaphysics to theology. There's no guilt in baseball, and it's never boring. That was her faith. People will believe in anything, folks. Why don't you give them something real to believe in? Paul shows us how to talk about God. I think it's something we ought to practice. We start where they are, no criticism. We're not pushy, eccentric, or half-cocked. We don't try to shove the gospel down their throats. We just tell them about Jesus. And as Luke adds to the ending of the story, a few people believed. Dionysius, a woman named Marius, and others with them. Now that doesn't sound like the results of a Billy Graham crusade, but I would say that's not a bad day at the office. So don't let go of your faith easily or quickly, and don't be bothered when some atheist gives you a big old bunch of nothing about why you shouldn't believe in God. It doesn't mean you're not smart. You are smart. Have a conversation about God with somebody this week. That's your assignment. One conversation. And then I'm going to ask you if you might stretch that to every week I'm going to have one conversation about God. Now, if this is unnerving to you, start with somebody who already loves you. You know, like your children who don't go to church anymore. You got to start somewhere, right? I'm going to do it. I'm going to call and talk to my son about God this week because my son's been going to church somewhere. It's not a real church and it's not Christian, and I would like for him to stop it. But that's not the way I'm going to talk to him about it. He'll just get mad and hang up if I do that. But I'm wondering if you would be willing to follow me and do this with me. And I wonder if 2 or 3 of you might come back and then let me know the results of your one conversation about God with somebody. Especially if it doesn't go well and you feel like you got beat up a little bit. You should come tell me and I will encourage you and I'll send you back out there to try again. See what happens. It's the least we can do. It's what it means to be Christian. Isn't it? Really? Isn't it? Okay, I'll quit now. That's it. I'm done.